Who were the Huns? How did a nomadic people with no cities, no written language, and no permanent home come to shake the very foundations of the Roman world? And why, after rising to such prominence, did they vanish almost as quickly as they appeared? In the late 4th and early 5th centuries, a new force emerged on the fringes of Europe, swift, mysterious, and terrifying to those who faced them. The Huns did not wage war with slow-moving armies or towering siege engines. They descended upon their enemies from the steppes with blinding speed, precision, and shock. To the Romans they appeared as an unstoppable wave from the east, driving countless tribes before them and rewriting the power map of Europe. This is not only the story of Attila, though his name will echo loudly through these pages, but the story of an entire people who rose from the obscurity of Central Asia to become one of the most feared names in history. This is the complete story of the Huns. Let us begin. Long before their name would strike terror into the Roman Empire, the Huns were an unknown people wandering across the vast, open grasslands of Central Asia. Their arrival on the western edge of the Eurasian steppe would become one of the most transformative migrations of the ancient world. But to understand their sudden rise, we must look east, deep into the heart of Inner Asia. The earliest roots of the Huns may lie among the ancient nomadic cultures of that immense region, stretching from modern-day Mongolia across Kazakhstan and toward the Caspian Sea. These lands had long been home to horse-riding peoples who mastered the art of mobile warfare, living by herding, raiding, and trade. Among them, the most powerful group before the Common Era were the Xiongnu, who appeared in Chinese records during the 3rd century BCE and posed a constant threat to the Han dynasty. For centuries, the Chinese and the Xiongnu fought bitter border wars, shifting alliances and long standoffs. The Great Wall itself, once a scattered chain of fortifications, was expanded and strengthened largely to resist these northern raids. The Xiongnu perfected a form of steppe warfare that would echo through the centuries. Fast-moving archers on horseback who struck suddenly and vanished before their enemies could react. Their society was built around powerful clans and a supreme ruler, a Khan who held his confederation together through prestige and force. These same patterns, nomadic warfare, clan-based politics, and using pressure against settled empires, would reappear in later steppe powers, including the Huns. By the 1st century CE, the Xiongnu's might began to fade. Internal divisions and relentless Han campaigns fractured their confederation. Some of their people scattered into Central Asia, absorbed by other nomadic cultures. Others perhaps drifted westward across the steppes toward the Black Sea. Here the historical trail goes cold. The Huns left behind no writings, no monuments, no inscriptions, nothing of their own voice. Everything we know of them comes from others: Greek, Roman, Persian, Chinese, and later Arab chroniclers. The first clear mention of the Huns appears in the late 4th century CE, when they burst suddenly into the affairs of the Roman world. Between the 1st and 4th centuries, something had changed. A people who shared many traits with earlier Inner Asian nomads began migrating steadily west. They left no records, but archaeology offers clues. Burials and artifacts found across Kazakhstan. The Urals and the Pontic steppe show continuity with older steppe traditions, yet with new styles of weaponry and horse gear. This suggests a blending of cultures, perhaps as different nomadic groups merged or were displaced by stronger rivals. One theory claims the Huns were pushed west by the expansion of other steppe powers such as the Ruran or early Turkic confederations. As one tribe moved, it forced another to follow, a chain reaction across the endless grasslands. This domino effect was a recurring rhythm of steppe geopolitics. By the mid-4th century CE, the Huns reached the Volga River, the eastern frontier of Europe, and at last caught Roman attention. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus described them as savage beyond comparison, living without towns or laws, eating raw meat, and speaking in sounds barely human. He claimed they were born in the saddle and died in it, their entire lives spent on horseback. While exaggerated and steeped in Roman bias, these words reflect the shock of encountering a people whose way of life defied all Roman understanding. Their arrival coincided with the collapse of another step, confederation, the Alans, an Iranian-speaking nomadic people. The Alans had long dominated the lands between the Caspian and Don rivers. But when the Huns arrived, they crushed them in brutal battles. Some Alans were slain, others fled, and the rest were absorbed into the Hunnic ranks. This absorption of defeated peoples would become a defining feature of Hunnic expansion. They grew not only by conquest but by integration, blending conquered tribes into their war machine. It gave them a vast and diverse manpower base without relying solely on their own population. By 370 CE, the Huns reached the Don River and collided with the Ostrogoths, a powerful Gothic kingdom ruled by King Ermanaric. His realm stretched from the Don to the Dniester, but it crumbled when the Huns' lightning cavalry broke through. Some say Ermanaric took his own life rather than see his people enslaved. The survivors fled west in panic, triggering a wave of migrations. The Visigoths, kinsmen of the Ostrogoths, soon felt the same pressure. Driven to desperation, they turned to the Eastern Roman Empire for refuge and were granted permission to cross the Danube in 376 CE. What followed changed history. Mistreatment by corrupt Roman officials sparked rebellion. 2 years later, the Visigoths annihilated a Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople, killing Emperor Valens himself. Though the Huns were not present on that battlefield, their shadow loomed large. It was their advance that set this chain of chaos in motion. By driving whole nations westward, they had become a catalyst for the unraveling of the Roman world. Yet the Huns themselves remained ghost-like. They built no cities, signed no treaties, and their early leaders remained nameless. They moved through the lands like a storm, unpredictable, devastating, and gone before anyone could understand them. To settled peoples, they seemed less like men and more like a natural disaster. But soon, this would change. As the Huns pressed deeper into Europe, they encountered not just wandering tribes, but the structured frontiers of Rome itself. They evolved from a scattered raiding force into a formidable empire in motion, one with ambition, leadership, and purpose. Their raids turned into campaigns, their bands into armies, and their chiefs into kings. From the steppes beyond the Volga, their advance ignited a chain reaction that forever altered Europe's destiny. One by one, tribes fled, fought, or fell, each pushing another before them in a relentless wave of migration. This great upheaval, from the mid-4th to early 5th centuries, would later be known as the Migration Period, the beginning of Europe's transformation and the twilight of Rome's old order. The first major shock came with the destruction of the Gothic realms between the Don and Dniester. The Ostrogoths were broken, their remnants scattered or subjugated. The Visigoths, pressed against the Danube, faced a terrible choice: stand and die, or cross into Roman lands. Led by their king Fritigern, they sought asylum in 376 CE. The Romans, under Emperor Valens, permitted their entry, expecting to settle them as farmers and soldiers along the border. But greed and cruelty undid the plan. Roman officials exploited the refugees, selling them food at outrageous prices while their children starved. Soon, anger turned to revolt. In 378 CE, outside the city of Adrianople, the Visigoths destroyed the Roman army. 2/3 of Rome's forces were wiped out, and Emperor Valens perished in the flames. It was a disaster, unlike any the empire had seen in centuries. Though the Huns were not there, their influence was unmistakable. They were the unseen hand behind the chaos that now consumed Rome. The shock of Adrianople shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. The empire had allowed outsiders to cross its borders, and those outsiders had crushed it. It was the first of many such blows. Across Europe, other tribes, pushed by the same Hunnic pressure, began to move. The Alans, now weakened, fled westward seeking new allies. The Vandals, another Germanic tribe, joined them, along with the Suebi. In the winter of 406 CE, these groups crossed the frozen Rhine, breaking through the Roman frontier. They poured into Gaul and Hispania, carving out new kingdoms from Roman lands. The Vandals would even go on to seize North Africa itself. All of this chaos traced back to the same source, the movement of the Huns. They did not plan it, but their advance reshaped everything. They were the storm that shattered Europe's fragile order, setting off migrations that neither emperors nor generals could contain, and as the Western world reeled, the Huns themselves grew stronger, uniting under powerful new leaders and preparing to enter history, not as shadows, but as conquerors. Among these groups were remnants of the Alans, Ostrogoths, and other nomadic peoples of the steppe. This diverse mix, united under Hunnic rule, evolved into a vast, multi-tribal war machine bound not by shared ethnicity, but by loyalty to powerful leaders and a common pursuit of plunder, wealth, and prestige. By the dawn of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was unraveling. It faced internal divisions, political corruption, economic decline, and a weakening military, all while waves of migrants and invaders pressed against its borders. The Huns' influence during this time was subtle yet decisive. Without their relentless pressure on the Gothic world, the chain of events that followed, the Gothic War, the sack of Rome in 410, and the collapse of the western provinces, might have unfolded very differently. The Roman scholar and theologian Jerome captured the despair of the age, lamenting, "The whole world is collapsing. The Roman world is falling, and we are still asleep." His words reflected the dread felt across the empire as Rome's dominance began to crumble. In the east, emperors in Constantinople sought to contain the growing chaos through diplomacy and gold. They paid off tribes, offering tribute in exchange for peace, hoping to buy stability along the frontiers. But this was only a temporary fix. The empire's borders had grown porous and its resources were stretched thin. The Western Empire, far weaker and plagued by political infighting, lacked both the money and manpower to cope amid the turmoil. A new breed of Roman generals rose to prominence, men like Flavius Stilicho in the west and Flavius Aetius a generation later. Many of them came from mixed Roman and barbarian backgrounds and understood the importance of diplomacy, tribal alliances, and calculated compromise. They hired Hunnic mercenaries to fight rival tribes, offered land to some peoples, and waged brutal wars to contain others. But their efforts were often reactive, desperate measures to manage an empire in decline. Rome was no longer setting the rules. It was struggling to survive them. Within this world of collapsing order, the Huns themselves were changing. By the early 5th century, figures like Uldin and later Rugila began to appear in Roman records, names that signaled a new era of Hunnic leadership. These men represented a transition from loose raiding bands to a more organized power capable of negotiation, diplomacy, and tribute collection. The Huns were learning to turn fear into political leverage. They were no longer content to raid and vanish. They demanded recognition, respect, and gold. Two key strengths sustained their rise. First, unmatched mobility. Their horse archers could traverse vast distances faster than Roman legions could react, striking like a storm and disappearing before pursuit began. Second, psychological warfare. They weaponized fear itself. Rumors of their brutality spread faster than their armies, breaking morale long before the first arrow flew. Villages surrendered, cities paid tribute, and Roman officials negotiated in panic, all without the Huns needing to shed much blood. This transformation, ready from mysterious steppe raiders to a recognized regional power, set the stage for the next phase of their story. But for now, they remained an ominous shadow at the empire's edge, powerful, feared, and watching. The world they had reshaped was one of constant upheaval. Tribes were migrating. Rome was losing control of its frontiers. Barbarian kingdoms were emerging in Gaul, Iberia, and North Africa. And through all of this, the Huns grew ever stronger, absorbing new warriors, refining their strategies, and waiting for their moment. By the closing years of the 4th century, the chain reaction the Huns had set in motion had already redrawn the map of Europe. They had crushed kingdoms across the steppe, ignited mass migrations, and destabilized the Roman world itself. Until this point, they had remained largely unseen, a storm behind the horizon. But now, in the final decades of the 370s and into the early 400s, they would step into the Roman world directly. No longer a distant terror, but a living, breathing force of history. Our most vivid early description of the Huns comes from the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus. Writing in the late 4th century, he described them as savage, inhuman, and terrifying, more like beasts than men. He claimed they ate raw meat, lived without homes, and spoke an incomprehensible tongue. Ammianus himself had never seen the Huns. His words were shaped by rumor and fear, but his portrayal endured. For centuries afterward, Roman writers would describe the Huns through the same lens: alien, barbaric, and otherworldly. By 395, the Huns had crossed into Roman territory in force. They swept across the Danube, raiding deep into the Balkans. These were no longer isolated skirmishes, they were coordinated campaigns testing Rome's defenses and bleeding its provinces. Cities were plundered, fortresses bypassed, and villages burned. The Roman legions, weakened by years of infighting, were too slow to counter them. But the Huns were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They did not occupy or govern. They raided for gold, livestock, and captives, then vanished back across the frontier. When Roman armies mobilized, the Huns were already gone. Their mobility was their greatest weapon. No walls could stop them. No frontier could contain them. The Roman defensive system, legions stationed along riverlines and fortified cities, was designed for slower, conventional enemies. It was helpless against the speed and unpredictability of steppe warfare. The Huns fought by different rules: ambushes, feints, encirclements, and constant motion. Their composite bows, used with deadly precision from horseback, gave them dominance in open terrain. To fight them on their terms was nearly impossible. Faced with this new kind of warfare, the Romans turned increasingly to diplomacy. The Eastern Empire, from its capital in Constantinople, opened negotiations with Hunnic leaders. Gold flowed eastward, tribute paid in exchange for peace. For the Romans, this was a pragmatic solution. It was cheaper to pay the Huns than to fight them. But to the Huns, these payments meant something very different. In their culture, tribute was not submission, it was acknowledgement of superiority. The Romans believed they were buying safety. The Huns believed they were being honored. This misunderstanding would haunt future relations between the two powers. Meanwhile, another strange dynamic began to unfold. Huns started appearing within Roman ranks as mercenaries. Desperate for skilled cavalry, Roman generals hired them to fight other tribes, and even other Romans. Flavius Stilicho, one of the last great Western generals, famously used Hunnic horsemen to crush revolts and defend Italy from Gothic invasions. These alliances blurred the lines between enemy and ally. The same warriors who raided Roman towns one year might serve in a Roman army the next. This paradox could not last forever. The Huns would not remain hired swords for long. They were learning Roman politics, studying its weaknesses, and building their own power base. As the 5th century progressed, they began to consolidate under increasingly powerful leaders. Figures like Uldin emerged as formidable warlords, commanding raids deep into Roman lands. In 408, Uldin attacked across the Danube and captured several Roman fortresses before being defeated near Castra Martis. His loss did little to slow Hunnic momentum. If anything, it proved how bold and organized they had become. Their presence in Roman politics only deepened. In 425, the ambitious Roman general Flavius Aetius, later known as the last of the Romans, turned to the Huns for help during a civil war. Hunnic cavalry answered his call, crossing into Italy to secure his victory and solidify his influence in the Western Empire. It was a fateful alliance. For the first time, the Huns were no longer simply raiders at the borders. They were power brokers inside the empire itself. Their riders could now decide who ruled in Ravenna and who fell. From this moment forward, the Huns were not just a threat to Rome's security. They had become a central force in its destiny. Their leaders had mastered the art of combining diplomacy and warfare, using each to strengthen the other. They studied Roman politics closely, learning to exploit rivalries and divisions within the empire. More and more, they began to view Rome not as an enemy to crush, but as a vast and intricate system to be manipulated for their own advantage. During this period, the Huns also began integrating a growing number of non-Hunnic peoples into their armies. They absorbed conquered tribes and attracted volunteers, men who saw opportunity and wealth in joining their ranks. Many of these newcomers brought skills that went beyond battle: craftsmanship, metalworking, and an understanding of Roman military engineering. Once dependent purely on speed and surprise, the Huns were now evolving into a more sophisticated force. By the early 430s, the balance of power in Europe was clearly shifting. The Huns were no longer a mere nuisance along the frontier. They were fast becoming a central factor in the political and military fate of both Eastern and Western Rome. Tribute payments grew heavier. Raids became larger and more coordinated. Entire Roman cities along the Danube began paying the Huns directly for protection. The empire was, in effect, buying time. By the late 4th century CE, the Roman world no longer operated within stable, controlled borders. What had once been a predictable system of diplomacy and defense was turning into a chaotic landscape driven by fear, movement, and instability. At the heart of this transformation lay the displacement of the Goths, a powerful people whose fate would bring the Huns and the Roman Empire into direct collision. The Visigoths, a branch of the Gothic nation, had long lived north of the Danube River. They farmed, traded, and maintained an uneasy peace with the Eastern Roman Empire. But their way of life was fragile, and the growing pressure from Hunnic expansion left them trapped. As the Huns advanced westward, crushing and absorbing the tribes before them, the Visigoths faced an impossible choice: fight and perish, or flee and plead for sanctuary. When the Ostrogothic king Hermanaric died, almost certainly as a result of overwhelming Hunnic pressure, panic spread through the Gothic world. The Ostrogoths collapsed as a political power, many of their warriors either killed or absorbed into Hunnic service. The Visigoths, now isolated, feared the same fate. Their king, Fritigern, made a desperate but calculated decision. Rather than face annihilation, he led his people to the Danube and appealed to the Romans for protection and settlement within the empire. In the year 376, Fritigern's envoys petitioned the Eastern Roman authorities to cross the river. They promised loyalty, service, and peace in exchange for refuge. Emperor Valens, then ruling from Constantinople, agreed. He saw the arrangement as mutually beneficial. He would keep the Goths under watch, fill the army's ranks, and secure the frontier. But what looked practical on paper soon became a disaster in execution. The Roman commanders charged with managing the migration, Lupicinus and Maximus, failed catastrophically. Supplies ran out, settlements were disorganized, and amid corruption and greed, Roman officials reportedly sold rotting dog meat to starving Gothic families in exchange for their children, who were enslaved. Hunger turned to fury. Fritigern, betrayed and desperate, rallied his people to revolt. The Goths swept through Thrace, looting towns and gathering support from other oppressed groups. Roman attempts to suppress the uprising faltered. Coordination was poor, and the Gothic forces proved far more capable than expected. Emperor Valens, hoping for personal glory, chose to face the Goths without waiting for reinforcements from the west. In the summer of 378, his army marched out of Constantinople and met the Gothic host near Adrianople. The Roman army, disciplined but overconfident, was outmatched by the enemy's mobility and cavalry. The Goths fought for survival, the Romans for pride. In the suffocating summer heat, battle began. Misled by false intelligence that the Goths were divided, Valens ordered a full assault. At first, the Roman infantry advanced steadily, but the Gothic cavalry, hidden and waiting, suddenly swept around both flanks. The Roman line broke. Panic spread. Under the blazing sun, tens of thousands were cut down. Emperor Valens himself perished, either slain on the field or burned alive inside a farmhouse where he sought refuge. 2/3 of his army was lost. Entire legions were annihilated. It was a catastrophe unmatched since Rome's defeat at Cannae 5 centuries earlier. The consequences of Adrianople were immediate and profound. The Eastern Empire was left defenseless. Gothic warbands roamed freely across the Balkans, sacking towns and avoiding pitched battles. Even Constantinople feared that its walls might soon fall. Only internal Gothic divisions and the city's formidable defenses spared it from collapse. But the deeper consequences were structural. The battle exposed Rome's fragility. Its armies were no longer suited to face large, fast-moving enemies. Its leaders failed to understand the risks of mass migrations and the limits of imperial control. And perhaps most devastating of all, it shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility. In the West, Emperor Gratian's government moved slowly and cautiously. Reinforcements came too late, and political disunity between the two halves of the empire crippled any unified response. Eventually, the Visigoths were granted a peace treaty, settling inside Roman territory on their own terms. For the Roman elite, it was a humiliation beyond words. A refugee people who had once begged for entry had now destroyed an emperor's army and forced the empire to negotiate. For the Huns, the victory was indirect yet decisive. Their pressure had sparked the migrations. Their name had haunted Roman decision-making. Their mere presence on the steppe had altered the fate of empires. Adrianople became proof of how the Huns could reshape history without even taking the field. After this disaster, Rome's military doctrine changed forever. Generals began emphasizing cavalry and mobility. They studied the methods of both Goths and Huns, and increasingly, Rome relied on federated troops, barbarian allies settled within its borders, to do its fighting. It was a dangerous necessity. The line between Rome and its enemies grew thinner each year. In Roman memory, Adrianople marked the beginning of decline. It revealed that the empire could bleed, that even its mightiest legions could be destroyed by peoples it had long dismissed as barbarians. Migration, once controllable, was now a tide that could not be stopped. And behind that tide, always lurking, were the Huns, still unseen, still distant, but moving ever closer. As the 5th century dawned, the Huns stepped out of the shadows. They were no longer strangers beyond the frontier. Their raids, alliances, and mercenary service tied them directly to the fate of Rome. No longer were they just destroyers, they were diplomats, power brokers, and manipulators. The empire that had once feared their arrows now paid them in gold and trusted them with command. Following Adrianople, both halves of Rome were exhausted. Neither had the strength to defend its borders alone. Out of desperation, they turned increasingly to outsiders, to auxiliaries, federates, and mercenaries. Among these, the Huns stood above all. Their speed, precision, and horsemanship were unmatched. Roman generals soon began hiring them in large numbers. The Huns fought in frontier wars, internal rebellions, and even in Roman civil conflicts, where gold mattered more than loyalty. Payments often went directly to Hunnic leaders, bypassing imperial bureaucracy. It was a business arrangement, not a partnership. The Huns fought not for Rome's ideals, but for profit and power. One of the clearest examples of this new dynamic came in the turbulent early 5th century. The Western court at Ravenna was paralyzed by intrigue and infighting, and in the middle of this chaos rose one man, Flavius Aetius. Aetius had spent part of his youth as a hostage among the Huns, a diplomatic practice meant to secure peace. But in that time, he learned far more than expected. He learned their tongue, their customs, their style of warfare. He gained the trust of Hunnic chieftains, and in doing so secured an advantage that would one day shape the destiny of the empire itself. In the year 425, when Flavius Aetius found himself on the losing side of a political struggle, he turned to the Huns for support. He negotiated with them to send thousands of cavalry to reinforce his cause. With their help, Aetius regained control over the Western Roman court and secured his position as the most powerful general in the empire. This episode revealed not only Aetius's strategic brilliance, but also the growing influence of the Huns as kingmakers in Roman internal politics. Over the following years, Aetius continued to employ Hunnic forces in campaigns against internal uprisings, rival barbarian tribes and imperial challengers. The arrangement served both parties well. The Huns received gold, tribute, and the spoils of war. Aetius gained a dependable military advantage in an increasingly unstable world, yet the relationship between Rome and the Huns was far from simple. While some Hunnic groups served as loyal mercenaries, others continued to raid Roman territories for their own benefit. Along the Danube frontier, Hunnic war bands would cross into Roman provinces, plunder towns, capture prisoners, and retreat before imperial forces could react. These incursions were not always declarations of war. Often, they were tools of diplomacy, pressure tactics to remind Rome of its obligations. If tribute was delayed, a treaty broken, or negotiations failed, a raid would often follow. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, faced these incursions frequently. Although wealthier and more administratively stable than its Western counterpart, the Eastern court relied on a fragile balance of diplomacy, payments, and occasional warfare to keep the Huns at bay. Roman envoys met regularly with Hunnic representatives to negotiate treaties that promised peace in exchange for gold. These payments were massive, at times consuming a substantial portion of the imperial treasury, but their success was inconsistent. Some Hunnic leaders respected the agreements. Others viewed them merely as temporary conveniences until more favorable opportunities appeared. Rome's tendency to treat the Huns as a unified people only worsened the situation. The Huns were never a single nation, but a shifting confederation of tribes, warbands, and independent chieftains. A treaty made with one faction meant nothing to another. Roman diplomacy, rooted in the idea of centralized governance, was ill-suited to handle such fluid dynamics. Still, the Romans saw the Huns as both a danger and a resource. Roman generals employed Hunnic warriors not just on battlefields but also as garrisons and auxiliaries in key frontier regions. They were stationed in Gaul, the Balkans, and other volatile provinces. Their presence helped suppress revolts and combat other barbarian tribes such as the Burgundians and the Franks. But their integration into Roman forces also deepened cultural exchange. Roman soldiers and civilians encountered Hunnic customs, tactics, and weaponry daily. Communities along the frontier adapted to this new reality. Tribute payments became routine, interpreters facilitated communication, and Roman cavalry began to incorporate Hunnic riding techniques. These subtle changes reflected a larger transformation within the empire during the 5th century. For the Huns, this period marked a time of growing sophistication and power. They learned from Rome's military systems, diplomatic structures, and bureaucratic habits. They observed Roman weaknesses, its divisions, its reliance on mercenaries, and its internal corruption. In doing so, they became more adept at manipulating the very empire that once dismissed them as savages. Meanwhile, Hunnic society itself was evolving. As wealth from tribute and plunder accumulated, certain leaders rose above others. Power began to concentrate in the hands of ambitious chieftains who combined military prowess with political vision. From among them emerged a man whose leadership would redefine Hunnic power, Rugila. Rugila's ascent was part of a wider shift toward unification. Earlier, Hunnic raids were carried out by scattered groups with little coordination, but Rugila managed to bring them together under his command. He established dominance over multiple tribes and transformed the Huns from a fragmented confederation into a centralized military power. Under his rule, the Huns began to act with collective purpose, negotiating as a single force and launching coordinated campaigns that spanned entire regions. Rugila also strengthened ties with powerful Roman figures, including Flavius Aetius. Their cooperation served both sides. Aetius gained access to unmatched cavalry forces, while Rugila secured steady wealth and influence within Roman politics. Yet Rugila was careful never to become dependent. He maintained the Huns' independence, extracting tribute from the Eastern Empire while balancing between ally and adversary. By the middle of the 5th century, it was clear that the Huns were no longer a distant threat. They were now at the very center of Roman affairs. As mercenaries, they reinforced imperial armies. As raiders, they ravaged provinces. As diplomats, they influenced the course of Roman leadership itself. Their relationship with the empire was pragmatic, never ideological. They did not seek to destroy Rome, but to exploit it, to draw its wealth, expand their power, and shape its politics to their advantage. Rome, weakened and divided, became entangled in this dependency. Each tribute payment and battlefield alliance only deepened its reliance on the Huns. By this time, Rome could no longer act in isolation. The empire and the steppe had become interwoven, two worlds bound together by necessity and ambition. By the early 5th century, Hunnic riders were an ever-present force in Roman lands, raiding one season, serving in Roman armies the next. Yet, despite their power, the Huns remained loosely organized, with authority scattered among rival leaders. That began to change under Rugila's leadership. Also known in some Roman accounts as Rua or Ruga, he was the first Hunnic leader to achieve genuine centralized control. His rule transformed the Huns from a nomadic coalition into a unified military confederation capable of confronting Rome directly. Little is known of Rugila's origins. Like many steppe rulers, he left no written record, and Roman chroniclers mentioned him only briefly. But his impact is undeniable. By the early 430s, Rugila had consolidated control over most of the Hunnic tribes of the Carpathian Basin and Western Steppe. Such unity was unprecedented. Hunnic society revolved around kinship, clan loyalty, and personal allegiance, forces difficult to bind under one ruler. Rugila's success likely stemmed from both strategic skill and diplomacy. He united factions through a mix of victories, alliances, and marriage ties. He also took advantage of Rome's divided diplomacy, positioning himself as the single authority through whom all Hunnic negotiations must pass. The geopolitical environment favored him. The Eastern Empire under Theodosius II was willing to pay handsomely for peace along the Danube. The weakened Western Empire, torn by internal rivalries, depended on Hunnic mercenaries for survival. Rugila exploited both. To Constantinople, he was a powerful ruler to be placated. To Ravenna, a trusted ally who could provide elite cavalry. Under his leadership, Hunnic warfare grew more organized and deliberate. Raids were no longer isolated acts of plunder, but calculated campaigns preceded by diplomacy. In the early 430s, Rugila threatened the eastern provinces along the lower Danube. Rather than fight, Constantinople paid a larger annual tribute acknowledging his supremacy. These tribute payments became central to Hunnic diplomacy. Rome viewed them as practical expenses. The Huns viewed them as submission. In steppe culture, tribute carried symbolic weight. It was proof of dominance. Rugila understood this and used it to strengthen his prestige among both his people and his Roman counterparts. The gold he received funded his empire. In steppe societies, a leader's authority depended on his ability to reward loyalty. With Roman wealth, Rugila paid his warriors, secured allegiance, and attracted new allies. This steady influx of gold stabilized his rule and laid the groundwork for greater ambitions. During his reign, the Huns also began establishing a more permanent center in the Carpathian Basin, a fertile region ideal for their herds and strategic for their campaigns. Though they did not build cities in the Roman sense, they created administrative hubs and seasonal encampments from which Rugila ruled. This shift from pure nomadism toward organized settlement marked a critical step in Hunnic state formation. Rugila's relationship with Rome remained complex, part friendship, part rivalry. He maintained close ties with Flavius Aetius, whose earlier years among the Huns had forged mutual respect. Together they represented a new political reality, a Rome that could no longer dominate by force alone, and a steppe power that had learned to wield diplomacy as effectively as the sword. Aetius relied heavily on Hunnic troops to crush rival factions and preserve stability in the Western Roman Empire. In exchange, Rugila received payments, honors, and political influence that elevated his standing among his people. The Eastern Empire, however, viewed Rugila with growing suspicion. His recurring demands for tribute and his sudden raids along the frontier were interpreted as veiled acts of extortion. Yet Emperor Theodosius II found himself with few viable alternatives. The Eastern armies were overextended with conflicts in the East and could not afford an all-out war with the Huns. As a result, Rugila maintained a position of remarkable strength, able to secure concessions from Constantinople without committing to sustained warfare. In matters of faith, Rugila appeared to adhere to traditional steppe beliefs rooted in animism, ancestor reverence, and sky worship. There is no evidence he converted to Christianity or encouraged Roman religious practices among his people. However, the Huns were pragmatic. They tolerated the customs of those they ruled or allied with. Over time, some subject groups, particularly those more closely tied to Roman frontiers, gradually adopted Christianity and certain aspects of Roman life. Rugila died sometime in the mid-4th century, likely around the year 434, though the precise date remains uncertain. His death marked both the close of an era and the dawn of a new one. In a rare example of dynastic succession among nomadic peoples, Rugila was succeeded not by a single heir, but by his two nephews, Attila and Bleda. This transition proved pivotal. Rugila's consolidation of Hunnic power provided the political and military foundation upon which his successors would build a formidable empire. By unifying the tribes, securing tribute from the Eastern Empire, and forging alliances in the West, he had left behind not merely a powerful army, but a functioning state. The rise of Rugila symbolizes a fundamental transformation in Hunnic history. Under his leadership, they evolved from scattered raiding bands into a centralized power capable of shaping the politics of empires. He never sought to conquer Rome outright. Instead, he mastered the art of leveraging Rome's wealth and internal divisions to his advantage. His rule was not driven by ideology or conquest for its own sake, but by a calculated understanding of power, loyalty, and opportunity. After Rugila's death in the early 430s, leadership of the Hunnic Confederation passed jointly to his nephews, Attila and Bleda. This marked the beginning of one of the most consequential eras in the history of the Huns. While Rugila had united the tribes and elevated them onto the European stage, it was under Attila and Bleda that the Huns began to operate like an empire, ambitious in vision and far-reaching in scope. Their joint reign brought a new era of political consolidation, complex diplomacy, and relentless military pressure, one that would make the Huns the dominant power in mid-5th century Europe. Attila and Bleda, likely sons of Rugila's brother Mundzuk, had grown up in the shadow of their uncle's achievements. Both were seasoned by years of warfare and diplomacy, well versed in Roman politics and frontier strategy. By the time of Rugila's passing, they had already gained the respect of the Hunnic elite, and their succession occurred without any recorded opposition, a rare instance of stability among steppe societies. This smooth transition suggests Rugila had successfully laid the groundwork for hereditary rule. The early years of their co-leadership were marked by consolidation and strategic diplomacy. The brothers divided responsibilities, each commanding separate forces, but acted together when needed. They ruled over a vast, multi-ethnic confederation that included not only Huns, but also subordinate and allied peoples such as the Alans, Goths, Sarmatians, and various Germanic groups. Holding such a coalition together required strength, political finesse, and shared purpose. One of their earliest major acts was diplomatic rather than military. In the year 435, Attila and Bleda concluded the Treaty of Margus with the Eastern Roman Empire. This treaty marked a significant milestone in Hunnic-Roman relations. Under its terms, the Romans agreed to double the annual tribute from 300 to 600 pounds of gold, to return all Hunnic fugitives who had sought asylum within the empire, and to open border markets to Hunnic merchants. In return, the Huns pledged to respect Roman frontiers and cease raiding. The Treaty of Margus showcased Attila and Bleda's political maturity. It brought financial security and official recognition to their rule while giving Constantinople a temporary respite from warfare. Yet, the peace it secured was fragile, more a pause than an end. Both sides used this time to assess their strength and prepare for inevitable conflict. In the ensuing years, the Huns intensified their internal organization. With tribute gold flowing in, Attila and Bleda strengthened their armies and rewarded their loyal chiefs. They advanced Rugila's efforts toward centralized command and began coordinating campaigns from their stronghold in the Carpathian Basin, a region that now served as the heart of their growing empire. Although they retained nomadic customs and clan loyalties, the brothers appear to have coordinated governance through councils and assemblies. There was no formal bureaucracy, but their efficiency in enforcing treaties, collecting tribute, and mobilizing armies reveals a functioning proto-state. As peace with the Eastern Empire persisted, tensions inevitably resurfaced. Disputes over borders, treaty breaches, and the harboring of Hunnic defectors reignited hostilities. To the Huns, the refusal to return fugitives was a grave insult and a challenge to their sovereignty. To the Romans, it was often a pragmatic decision, retaining skilled individuals or avoiding political complications. By the year 440, Attila and Bleda struck back. Their forces swept across the Danube into the Balkans, devastating Moesia and Thrace. Roman defenses were feeble, their cities neglected and undermanned after years of strain. The Huns sacked towns, seized gold, livestock, and supplies, and enslaved countless captives. The Eastern court, desperate and overwhelmed, resumed tribute payments, offering even greater sums to purchase peace. Thus, the familiar cycle of raid and ransom began anew. During this time, Hunnic diplomacy grew increasingly sophisticated. Attila and Bleda received Roman envoys with ceremony, negotiated complex agreements, and refined their diplomatic protocols. The Roman envoy Priscus, who later visited Attila's court, would describe an environment of surprising order and ceremony, an empire in nomadic form. Despite their effective partnership, cracks began to show between the brothers. Contemporary sources depict Attila as the more ambitious and daring of the two. Bleda appeared more conservative, content with the structures inherited from Rugila, while Attila sought to expand power and reform leadership. This growing divide foreshadowed the inevitable conflict between them. By the mid-440s, Bleda was dead, most likely around the year 445. The circumstances remain unclear. Some accounts imply Attila orchestrated his brother's death to seize full control, while others record his passing without explanation. Given the political realities of the steppe, either version is plausible. With Bleda gone, Attila emerged as the sole ruler of the Huns. This moment marked a turning point in the history of Eurasia. Under joint leadership, the Huns had become a formidable regional power. Under Attila alone, they would rise to an empire that shook the foundations of the Roman world. Yet even before Attila's solo reign, the co-rule of the two brothers had already redefined European geopolitics. The Huns had evolved from opportunistic raiders into organized power brokers. They had extracted immense wealth from Constantinople, manipulated Western politics, and demonstrated the capacity for sustained, large-scale warfare. Their actions under the Treaty of Margus and beyond had cemented their place as a permanent force in late antiquity. The Treaty of Margus itself, signed in the year 435, was not merely a truce, it was a strategic masterpiece. It encapsulated the delicate balance of power between the Eastern Roman Empire and the ascendant Huns. Negotiated in the Roman city of Margus, on the Danube frontier of modern Serbia, it represented both sides' pragmatic need for peace and profit. The Roman delegation, led by high-ranking officials under Emperor Theodosius II, sought to avoid war at all costs. For the Huns, it was an opportunity for legitimacy, wealth, and recognition as equals to the empire. The treaty's terms reflected the shifting power dynamic. The Eastern Empire pledged to double its gold payments from £300 to £600 annually, an enormous sum that symbolized submission as much as appeasement. They also agreed to return Hunnic fugitives and open frontier markets to Hunnic traders. For the Huns, these terms represented more than material gain. In the world of the steppe, tribute carried symbolic meaning. It was proof of superiority and respect. For the Romans, it was simply the price of survival. Through this balance of coercion and diplomacy, Attila and Bleda transformed the Huns from feared nomads into recognized rulers. Their empire was no longer defined merely by raids and war, but by negotiation, organization, and the mastery of imperial politics. The Romans believed that encouraging trade would stabilize relations and create a peaceful bridge between the two powers. In return for these concessions, Attila and Bleda pledged to cease their raids and respect the Danube frontier. At least in principle, this ushered in a brief period of calm. Yet beneath the surface, the peace was fragile. The very design of the treaty revealed its imbalance. Rome paid for peace, while the Huns used that peace to grow stronger. To Attila and Bleda, the tribute was far more than a bribe. It was a declaration of their superiority. It proved that even the mighty Roman Empire acknowledged their power. The treaty carried deep symbolic weight. It signaled to surrounding barbarian tribes that the Huns now stood on equal diplomatic ground with Rome. This newfound prestige helped secure the loyalty of their diverse subjects and allies. The steady flow of Roman gold allowed them to reward warriors, fund military expansion, and strengthen their political network. For several years after the Treaty of Margus, an uneasy peace held. Attila and Bleda turned their focus inward, working to tighten their control over the vast Hunnic Confederation and enhance their military strength. All the while, they kept a careful watch on Roman behavior. Any perceived slight, a late payment, a missing fugitive, a broken promise, could be used as justification for war. Tensions inevitably resurfaced when the Romans, whether through negligence or defiance, failed to honor the treaty's condition. One especially inflammatory incident involved the Bishop of Margus, who was accused of crossing the Danube and robbing sacred Hunnic tombs. Such an act was not only theft, but an unforgivable insult to Hunnic spiritual tradition. When the Huns demanded his surrender, Roman officials hesitated. According to some accounts, the bishop betrayed his own city to save himself, opening its gates to Attila's forces. The Huns crossed the Danube and destroyed Margus, breaking the peace the treaty had promised. The Eastern Roman response was slow and weak. Rather than mounting a serious counterattack, Emperor Theodosius II's court chose once again to negotiate. In the years that followed, Attila and Bleda led further incursions into Roman territory, claiming treaty violations as their cause. Cities along the Danube, Moesia and Dacia, were plundered and burned. Fortresses fell with little resistance. Captives were taken by the thousands, and the spoils of war flowed back to Hunnic lands. These were not mindless acts of destruction. They were deliberate moves designed to pressure Constantinople into renewing and increasing its tribute payments. By the early 440s, Rome relented once again. The annual gold tribute was raised, and new clauses were added to secure the movement of Hunnic envoys and traders. Some Roman advisors criticized Theodosius II for weakness, but he saw it as a necessary compromise, a way to buy time while the empire dealt with other crises. For the Huns, these payments served multiple purposes. They enriched the ruling class, funded military campaigns, and reinforced Attila and Bleda's authority over their vast coalition. Each gold shipment from Constantinople was more than wealth. It was proof of Rome's fear. It was a symbol of submission. This cycle of tribute and intimidation emboldened Attila. He began to understand that the Romans could be manipulated not only through force, but through diplomacy. He studied their customs, hosted their envoys, and communicated in their formal style. He presented himself not merely as a barbarian chieftain, but as a sovereign equal to the emperors of both Constantinople and Ravenna. The Treaty of Margus, therefore, became more than a temporary peace. It was the beginning of a new era in Hunnic-Roman relations, one where the Huns could dictate terms, shape policies, and operate as political equals. They were no longer outsiders to be fought off, but participants in the geopolitical game of late antiquity. They exploited Rome's weaknesses, mastered its systems, and turned its wealth into the foundation of their power. But the peace was never built to last. As tribute demands grew heavier and Roman pride waned, it became clear that gold alone could not secure safety. Eventually, the Huns would seek something greater: recognition, territory, or dominion itself. By the mid-5th century, the Hunnic Empire had reached a turning point. Its power, wealth, and influence had grown through a potent mix of violence, diplomacy, and coercion. The joint rule of Attila and Bleda had achieved stability and fearsome prestige. Yet that balance was about to shatter. In an event cloaked in mystery, Bleda vanished from history, leaving Attila as the sole ruler of the Huns. From this point onward, one man's vision would define the fate of an empire. The circumstances of Bleda's death remain uncertain. No detailed record survives, only scattered mentions. Some Roman historians accused Attila of fratricide, of killing his brother to seize full control. Others simply noted that Bleda died around the year 445 without explanation. Given the traditions of steppe politics, where ambition often outweighed kinship, the idea of Attila eliminating his brother is entirely believable. Yet in the absence of proof, historians can only infer motives through outcomes. What is beyond doubt is that Attila emerged from this moment as the undisputed master of the Hunnic Empire. Under joint rule, decisions had required discussion and compromise. Now, with all authority concentrated in Attila's hands, command became swift and absolute. This centralization gave the Huns new strength and unity. It allowed Attila to direct their full might toward his ambitions. And his first target was once again Rome. He claimed the Eastern Empire had failed to honor its promises, especially regarding the return of fugitives and the fair treatment of Hunnic traders. These grievances, whether genuine or strategic, became his pretext for renewed war. Attila sent envoys to Constantinople bearing demands, higher payments, stricter adherence to treaties, and official recognition of Hunnic rights within Roman markets. Theodosius II, wary and weakened by natural disasters and internal unrest, hesitated to fight. He chose appeasement once again. But Attila was no longer content with tribute alone. When his demands were met with delay, he unleashed his armies. In the late 440s, Attila led a massive invasion across the Danube. His forces swept through the Balkans with unmatched speed and precision. They bypassed strong fortresses and struck vulnerable towns, trade routes, and supply centers. The destruction was catastrophic. Mysia, Dacia, and Thrace were devastated. Cities burned, populations were enslaved, and entire regions were left desolate. Roman armies proved helpless, scattered, and too slow to respond. Attila's campaign was more than conquest, it was psychological warfare. He let rumors of his approach spread ahead of him, turning fear itself into a weapon. Panicked cities surrendered before the Huns even arrived. This allowed him to preserve his forces and continue his advance with minimal resistance. Even amid this chaos, Attila maintained the facade of diplomacy. He continued to receive Roman envoys and negotiate between campaigns. He spoke of peace but wielded terror as leverage. He portrayed himself as a ruler who sought fairness, not bloodshed. If only Rome would respect his authority. This careful balance between savagery and statesmanship defined Attila's reign. He combined ruthless warfare with calculated negotiation, proving that domination could be achieved through both fear and formality. Theodosius II had no real answer. He increased payments once more, sending yet more gold eastward in hopes of buying time. But every concession only deepened Rome's humiliation. Attila now demanded not just money but recognition. He called himself the Scourge of God, presenting his conquests as divine judgment upon the Roman world. Though he never adopted Christianity, he skillfully used its language and symbols, turning religion itself into a tool of intimidation. Within his empire, Attila ruled through a mix of loyalty, reward, and fear. His court, located somewhere in the Hungarian plains, served as both a royal seat and a military command center. It hosted nobles from countless tribes, Goths, Alans, Gepids, and others, all bound by allegiance and the promise of spoils. He offered autonomy to those who obeyed, but swift destruction to any who defied him. Through this system of discipline and shared interest, Attila forged one of the most formidable empires of the ancient world, one that stood not only as a military power, but as a shadow government to Rome itself. Attila used the tribute gold not merely as wealth, but as a tool to bind allies and secure the loyalty of his most vital commanders. Under his rule, the Hunnic Empire began to evolve beyond its nomadic origins, adopting more formal structures that blended the traditions of the steppe with the ceremonial influence of Rome. The Hunnic court, though far simpler than the opulent halls of the Roman emperors, displayed an emerging sense of hierarchy and order. Visitors spoke of clear ranks, established protocols, and a disciplined administrative rhythm. Attila's court was not one of indulgence, but of command. He positioned himself not as a Roman emperor ruling by institution, but as a divine ruler in the ancient tradition of the steppes, a paramount Khan whose word carried absolute authority. One of the most vivid depictions of Attila's court comes from Priscus, a Roman envoy who visited in the late 440s. Priscus described a wooden hall filled with guards, advisors, and foreign envoys where Attila presided with quiet dominance. He wore simple garments and ate plain food, yet his presence inspired both reverence and fear. Power radiated from his restraint, not his luxury. This was a ruler who did not need gold to prove his strength. His will alone was enough. The death of his brother Bleda and Attila's rise to sole leadership brought unity and purpose to the Hunnic realm. For the first time, its vast territories and diverse tribes moved according to one man's vision. Attila had mastered both war and diplomacy, learning from Rome's weaknesses and the lessons of earlier decades. Under his command, the Huns ceased to be mere raiders. They became the arbiters of Europe's destiny. With absolute control over his confederation, Attila launched the most formidable phase of his rule. His gaze turned toward the Eastern Roman Empire, which had been weakened by political turmoil and military defeat. What followed was no longer the lightning raids of earlier years, but a calculated and devastating campaign, one that would cripple the Eastern Empire and define the zenith of Hunnic power. By the mid-5th century, relations between the Huns and the Eastern Romans had collapsed entirely. Treaties that once promised peace were now shattered. Disputes over trade routes, fugitives, and unpaid tributes became pretexts for full-scale war. Yet beneath these grievances lay Attila's true aim: total domination. Gold was no longer enough. He sought to break the Eastern Empire's pride. Around the year 447, Attila launched his most destructive invasion of the Balkans. His army, a vast coalition of Huns, Ostrogoths, Alans, and Gepids, moved with unmatched coordination and speed. The Roman forces, caught off guard, faltered in every direction.
City after city fell.
Nisus, modern-day Nish, was razed to the ground, its population slaughtered or enslaved. Chroniclers would later write that the city ceased to exist as an urban center for decades. Across the Balkans, Roman towns burned, their churches desecrated, their people scattered. Attila's campaign was not random destruction, it was strategy. Rather than besieging Constantinople directly, he struck the empire's backbone, the network of roads, cities, and fortresses that sustained its military power. His aim was to paralyze the empire from within. Panic spread through the provinces as refugees fled toward the safety of fortified cities. For the first time, the Huns displayed mastery of siege warfare, a skill likely borrowed from their subject peoples. The Ostrogoths, familiar with Roman engineering, helped construct siege engines and scale walls. This new capability revealed Attila's adaptability. His empire was learning and evolving with every campaign. In Constantinople, fear gripped the imperial court. Emperor Theodosius II, long accustomed to buying peace with gold, found his usual tactics failing. The empire's armies were shattered, its generals demoralized. Desperation took hold. The great Theodosian walls of Constantinople were reinforced, and hastily rebuilt defenses were thrown up across the Balkans. But none of it was enough. Finally, the empire turned once more to negotiation. The Roman envoy Anatolius, a seasoned diplomat, was sent to Attila's camp. But this time, it was not Rome dictating terms. It was the Huns. Attila received the embassy with the calm confidence of an emperor in all but name. The result was humiliation for the Eastern Empire. The annual tribute was tripled to over £2,000 of gold, and a one-time indemnity of £6,000 was demanded for past offences. Worse still, Rome was forced to cede a wide strip of land along the Danube, effectively surrendering imperial authority in the region. Attila had achieved complete victory without ever laying siege to Constantinople. The Balkans were in ruins, the empire's treasury drained, and its pride shattered. In every sense, this was more than conquest. It was domination. To his enemies, Attila became something beyond human, a scourge sent by God to punish the sinful empire. Even Christian writers of the time described him as divine wrath made flesh. Yet for all his power, Attila had no interest in occupying Roman land. His people were nomadic. They did not seek cities or provinces to rule. Their empire was one of motion and fear. Attila sought tribute, submission, and recognition, not governance. When those were secured, withdrawal was victory, not retreat. The gold extracted from Constantinople flooded into Attila's camp, strengthening his army and cementing his authority. His court, somewhere on the plains of modern-day Hungary, became the center of a new world order. Envoys arrived from every direction, the Western Romans, the Goths, even the Persians, seeking peace or favor. Attila stood at the height of his power, having proven that the mightiest empire of the age could be subdued by will alone. But Attila knew the limits of his campaign. Prolonged wars drained his forces and strained the loyalty of his subjects. Once his goals in the east were achieved, he turned his gaze westward, toward a weakened Western Roman Empire teetering on collapse. The Western Empire, by this time, was a shadow of its former self. Its capital had moved from Rome to Ravenna, a city of marshes more defensible but far removed from the empire's heart. Emperor Valentinian III held the title, but little true authority. Real power lay with his general, Flavius Aetius, a man as shrewd as he was battle-hardened, once even allied with the Huns themselves to defeat his Roman rivals. But alliances born of necessity rarely last. Relations between Attila and the Western court had grown tense. The fragile balance that had once united them was breaking. And then came the scandal that would ignite the final storm. The affair of Honoria. Honoria, the emperor's sister, had been forced into an unwanted marriage arranged for political convenience. In rebellion, she sent a secret plea and her ring to Attila, begging for rescue. Whether she intended it or not, Attila took the gesture as a proposal of marriage. He declared her his betrothed and demanded half of the Western Empire as her dowry. The Roman court was outraged. Emperor Valentinian III dismissed the claim as madness, but Attila saw in it the perfect justification for war. One last opportunity to bring the West to its knees, just as he had done with the East. But for Attila, it was a golden opportunity. He had discovered a justification, or however tenuous, to wage war against the Western Roman Empire under the noble guise of restoring his supposed bride's honor and claiming what he called his rightful inheritance. Gaul, fractured and unstable, provided the perfect battleground for such an undertaking. Though nominally under Roman control, the region was divided among semi-independent powers. Local Roman governors ruled with near autonomy, while vast territories were held by barbarian kingdoms such as the Visigoths under Theodoric III, the Burgundians, and the Franks. Their loyalties shifted constantly, shaped by convenience rather than allegiance. It was an empire in name only, and Attila recognized the opening. A campaign into Gaul offered him several rewards at once: the expansion of Hunnic influence, deep into Roman territory, the humiliation of imperial power, the domination of rival barbarian tribes, and the promise of immense plunder. With his objectives set, Attila gathered a massive host, not only Huns, but an array of subject peoples including Ostrogoths, Alans, Gepids, and Sarmatians. By the spring of 451, his armies crossed the Rhine and thundered into Gaul. The invasion was swift, merciless, and apocalyptic in scale. City after city fell beneath the weight of the advancing horde. Metz, Reims, and Cambrai were among the first to be attacked, their inhabitants slaughtered, their churches plundered, their walls razed to dust. Panic swept through the land. Refugees fled south, and the Roman administration, hollowed by years of decline, struggled to organize any meaningful defense. Paris, then known as Lutetia, narrowly escaped destruction. Later legends tell of St. Genevieve rallying the people in prayer, a story that may blend faith and folklore, but it captures the terror that seized the Roman world as Attila's shadow grew longer. His true objective, however, was not Paris. It was the fortified city of Aurelianum, modern-day Orléans, a rich and strategically vital stronghold in the heart of Gaul. Attila laid siege to Orléans, and its fall seemed inevitable. But by then, Rome had finally stirred. General Flavius Aetius, the empire's last great commander, had forged an unlikely alliance with Theodoric the Faint and the Visigoths. Together they gathered a coalition of Romans, Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, and other tribal forces, a rare unity among factions that had long distrusted one another. As Attila pressed his siege, word reached him that Aetius and Theodoric were approaching with a formidable army. Realizing he might be trapped between the city's defenders and the incoming coalition, Attila withdrew northward toward the open plains of Catalaunian, preparing for a decisive confrontation. Thus began one of the most legendary battles of the late ancient world, the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. This clash would determine the fate of Western Europe and mark a turning point in Attila's unstoppable rise. When Attila's forces retreated to the plains, he chose his ground with care. The wide open field suited his cavalry perfectly. The Huns relied on speed, maneuverability, and archery, and the flat terrain would give them every advantage. The Roman Visigothic coalition, meanwhile, assembled in massive numbers, perhaps tens of thousands strong. Aetius commanded the Roman and Frankish troops, while Theodoric led the Visigoths. On the other side, Attila stood at the center of his horde, flanked by Germanic allies such as the Ostrogoths and Gepids. His strategy was clear: strike fast, pierce the Roman center, and shatter the coalition before its diverse components could act in unity. As the battle began, waves of Hunnic cavalry surged forward, darkening the sky with arrows. The ground trembled under the thunder of hooves. The Romans held their line, their heavy infantry bracing behind shields as arrows rained down. The Visigoths counterattacked fiercely, engaging the Huns and their allies in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The fighting was chaotic, furious, and without mercy. Dust and blood filled the air. Neither side could gain a decisive edge. Then, late in the day, Theodoric led a daring charge against Attila's flank. His bold assault broke through parts of the Hunnic line and nearly split Attila's formation in two. But in the chaos, Theodoric fell. Whether slain by the enemy or crushed beneath his own horsemen, no one could say. His death might have shattered the morale of his troops. Instead, it ignited their fury. Under the leadership of his son Thorismund, the Visigoths fought with renewed vengeance. Their counterattack pushed Attila's forces back toward their camp. As night fell, the plain was strewn with corpses, a grim testament to one of the bloodiest days of the century. Realizing his army risked encirclement, Attila ordered a withdrawal. He fortified his camp with wagons in the traditional steppe fashion, forming a defensive ring and bracing for a counterattack. For a moment, it appeared that Aetius and the coalition might annihilate him completely. But Aetius, ever the strategist, hesitated. Historians have long debated his motives. Some believe he feared that if Attila were destroyed, the Visigoths would become too powerful, threatening Roman authority in Gaul. Others suggest his troops were simply too exhausted to continue fighting. Whatever the reason, the coalition did not press its advantage, and Attila, bloodied but unbroken, survived to fight another day. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains was not a decisive victory for either side, but it was the first time Attila's advance had been halted. His aura of invincibility was shattered. He had failed to conquer Gaul, and his army had suffered staggering losses. The momentum that had once carried the Huns across Europe had begun to wane. For Rome, the battle was a rare triumph, a momentary resurgence of its fading glory. Aetius was hailed as the savior of the West, the last of the Romans, whose cunning diplomacy and leadership had preserved the empire from destruction. The Visigoths, despite their king's death, emerged stronger, their prestige and influence rising across Gaul. The aftermath reshaped the balance of power in Western Europe. The Huns remained formidable, but no longer unstoppable. Rome's aristocracy, though still corrupt and divided, gained a brief reprieve from the empire's inevitable collapse. And among the barbarian kingdoms, a growing sense of independence began to take root, the first seeds of the medieval world to come. As for Attila, he retreated eastward, his pride wounded, but his will unbroken. The loss at Catalaunum was a setback, not a surrender. His forces, though bloodied, remained vast. His coffers overflowed with tribute, and his name still inspired both terror and respect. He had lost a battle, but not the war. Even as his banners disappeared over the horizon, Attila was already planning his next move. The next target of his fury would not be Gaul, it would be Italy itself. In the wake of the stalemate, the world knew that the Huns had been slowed, but not stopped. Attila's empire still loomed large, his ambition undimmed. Europe had survived his storm once. Whether it could survive it again was a question soon to be answered in fire. His legend as the scourge of empires still loomed large, and his hunger for conquest burned as fiercely as ever. Now Attila's gaze turned southward, to the heartland of the Roman world itself. Fresh from his campaign in Gaul, he began preparing for what would become his final and most daring endeavor, the invasion of Italy. The Western Roman Empire, battered by years of turmoil and corruption, was in no condition to resist. Emperor Valentinian III still held the throne, but his power was hollow, and the imperial court at Ravenna was paralyzed by infighting and fear. Flavius Aetius, the hero of the Catalaunian victory, had struggled to hold together his fragile coalition. The Visigoths had withdrawn to their own lands, and other allies had drifted away. Italy now stood naked before the storm, its defenses fractured, its armies scattered, its confidence broken. Attila, ever the master strategist, saw the opportunity with brutal clarity. In the spring of 4152 he launched his campaign. His vast and diverse host, Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Alans, and countless other subject tribes, poured through the Julian Alps and swept into the fertile plains of northern Italy. This was not a mere raid. It was a calculated strike at the symbolic and political heart of the Roman West. His first major target was Aquileia, a rich and fortified city guarding the northeastern approaches to Italy. The siege was fierce and protracted. The defenders fought valiantly, but the Hunnic assault was relentless. After weeks of bloodshed, the walls finally fell. What followed was annihilation. Aquileia was erased, its walls torn down, its inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved, its temples and homes reduced to ash. The destruction was so complete that the city never truly rose again. For generations its ruins stood as a ghostly reminder of Hunnic wrath. The fall of Aquileia sent waves of terror rippling through Italy. Panic spread from city to city as refugees flooded southward. Some fled into the marshes of the Venetian lagoon, where they built temporary shelters on the islands, a desperate act that would, centuries later, give birth to Venice. Others took refuge in fortified cities like Milan and Ravenna, praying the storm would pass them by. Emboldened by victory, Attila's army swept through the Po Valley like a plague. Verona, Vicenza, Padua all fell in swift succession. The pattern was the same everywhere. Walls breached, churches plundered, treasures seized, people enslaved. The Roman military response was feeble at best. Aetius, recognizing the futility of direct confrontation, adopted a strategy of cautious observation, hoping to contain rather than challenge the invaders. And yet, despite the devastation he unleashed, Attila did not march on Rome itself. Historians have long debated why. Some point to logistics. The Hunnic army was far from its base, and northern Italy's resources had already been stripped bare. Others argue he feared the symbolic risk of sacking the Eternal City, especially after Alaric's infamous conquest only decades earlier. Perhaps disease, fatigue, and the threat of Eastern Roman forces massing beyond the Danube all weighed on his decision. Whatever the cause, Attila halted his advance near the River Po. There, a Roman delegation approached, led by Pope Leo I, accompanied by senior officials like the consul Avienus and the prefect Trigetius. The details of their meeting remain lost to time. Later, Christian accounts claimed that Pope Leo's holiness alone persuaded the Hunnic king to withdraw, even suggesting Attila beheld divine visions warning him not to harm Rome. Yet the truth was likely more pragmatic. His men were dying of disease, famine loomed, and his rear was threatened by Eastern Roman forces. Continuing the campaign risked disaster, so Attila agreed to retreat. He left Italy as swiftly as he had entered it, sparing Rome, but leaving behind a trail of ruin. It was not a defeat, merely a recognition of limits. His final campaign had brought terror and plunder, but no enduring conquest. The Western Empire, though ravaged, survived a little longer. For Rome, the invasion was both calamity and deliverance. Northern Italy lay in ruins, its economy crippled, its population shattered. Yet the fact that Rome itself endured gave the dying empire a fleeting sense of divine favor. Pope Leo's diplomacy elevated the prestige of the papacy, foreshadowing the Church's rise as a moral power, even as imperial authority withered. Attila returned to his headquarters on the Hungarian plains. Though the Huns' momentum had slowed, their power still commanded awe and fear across Europe. Envoys and emissaries continued to visit his court, bringing tribute from trembling nations. Attila, undeterred, began planning new campaigns, perhaps another strike at Constantinople, or a renewed push westward. The Hunnic Confederation, strained but unbroken, still stood behind its iron ruler, and then, without warning, the storm ended. After years of relentless conquest, after subduing empires, burning cities and terrifying the known world, Attila the Hun died suddenly, not in battle but in bed. His death came on a night of celebration, under circumstances so strange that they have echoed through history ever since. According to the historian Priscus, Attila's death occurred in the spring following his Italian campaign. Around the year 453, the event took place not on a battlefield, but during his wedding feast. Though already married many times, as was the custom among steppe rulers, Attila had taken a new bride, a young woman named Ildiko, described as a beautiful maiden of Germanic descent. The marriage was both personal and political, part of Attila's strategy of securing loyalty among his allies. The feast that night was grand. Priscus wrote that Attila, usually disciplined and reserved even in celebration, allowed himself to indulge more freely than usual. He drank deeply, laughed loudly, and reveled with his companions. Later, he retired to his chamber with his bride. By morning, he was dead. The official account claimed that he suffered a fatal hemorrhage, perhaps a ruptured blood vessel or a severe nosebleed, that caused him to choke in his sleep. Some believed he had drunk too heavily and could not wake as the bleeding began. Others speculated about an underlying illness. But not everyone accepted the natural explanation. Rumors spread swiftly that Ildiko had murdered him, perhaps on orders from enemies or in revenge.
Others whispered of poison.
The idea that such a formidable conqueror could perish from something so ordinary seemed unthinkable. Surely the scourge of God, who had defied two empires, could not be felled by his own body. Whatever the truth, Attila's death shocked the ancient world. His followers mourned with savage ritual. Priscus describes warriors slashing their faces so that their leader would be honored with blood. Not tears, the only fitting tribute for a man who had never bled in defeat. His burial was carried out in secret. According to legend, Attila was entombed in a triple coffin, one of gold, one of silver, one of iron. Gold for his glory, silver for his wealth, and iron for his might. The slaves who dug the grave were executed afterward to conceal its location forever. No one has ever found it. But with Attila gone, the empire he had built began to crumble almost immediately. His dominion had been held together not by law or institutions, but by his will alone. The Hunnic Confederation, an uneasy alliance of Huns, Goths, Alans, Gepids, and others, was bound together by fear and loyalty to the man at its center. Without him, that unity disintegrated. He left behind several sons, the most prominent being Elac. But the steppe tradition did not follow orderly succession. Rivalry erupted among his heirs, each vying for control. Tribal leaders, long subjugated under Hunnic dominance, seized the chance to reclaim their freedom. The empire that had once terrorized two worlds now began to tear itself apart. The first great rebellion came from the Gepids, a Germanic people long oppressed by Hunnic rule. Their defiance would spark the wars that would shatter Attila's legacy once and for all. The man who had been feared as the hand of divine wrath was gone. His death marked not only the end of his reign, but the end of an age. The world he had shaped through fire and fear would never see his like again. Under their king Ardaric, the Gepids united other dissatisfied tribes and rose against the heirs of Attila. This unrest reached its climax in the Battle of Nidau, a decisive confrontation that occurred not long after Attila's death. Though that battle falls beyond the immediate focus of this account, it is worth noting that the fragile unity of the Hunnic Empire, so carefully maintained by Attila himself, could not endure without his commanding presence. From the Roman perspective, the death of Attila was greeted with a mixture of relief and lingering apprehension. Both the Eastern and Western courts had come to dread his name. His uncanny ability to extract concessions had deeply undermined imperial pride and stability. With his passing, Roman leaders seized a rare opportunity to reassert their control, rebuild their defenses, and recover from the devastation his campaigns had brought. Yet they also knew the danger had not completely vanished. Attila's sons, though divided, still commanded formidable forces, and the restless tribes of the steppe had not been pacified. Culturally, Attila's death entered the realm of legend. In Germanic heroic poetry, he became Etzel, the mighty king immortalized in the Nibelungen Lied. Christian chroniclers, on the other hand, portrayed him as God's scourge, a divine punishment for Roman sins. Among the peoples of the steppe, he endured as the ultimate symbol of conquest and warrior glory, a ruler both feared and revered. Yet beyond all the myths and epics, one fact remained unembellished. The man who had shaken the Roman world to its core did not perish in battle, but in his sleep on the night of his wedding, in the arms of a young bride during a celebration of life. It was an ending strangely peaceful, yet hauntingly fitting for a figure whose existence had been nothing short of mythic. Attila's death marked the end of an age, but not the immediate collapse of his empire. For a short time, the vast confederation he had held together through charisma, intimidation, and political cunning remained intact. Beneath the surface, however, its foundations were crumbling. With no single figure capable of matching his authority, rivalries flared, old resentments re-emerged, and the subjugated peoples began to rebel. Within only a few years, one of the most formidable military powers Europe had ever seen descended into chaos and self-destruction. Attila left several sons, Elac, Dengizic, and Ernak among them. But though all were of royal blood, none possessed their father's unifying strength. Among the Huns, succession was not a matter of simple inheritance. Power was earned through strength, loyalty, and victory. Elac, believed to be Attila's eldest and chosen heir, attempted to establish himself as supreme ruler. Yet his brothers and the chiefs of subject tribes refused to recognize his claim. Meanwhile, those same tribes, the Gepids, Ostrogoths, Rugians, and Heruli, saw their chance to break free from Hunnic rule. Bound in Attila's lifetime by tribute, forced conscription, and political marriages, they now turned their discontent into open rebellion. The decisive showdown came at the Battle of Nedao.
Fought within 2 or 3 years of Attila's death.
This was no foreign invasion, but a civil war, a final struggle between the remnants of his empire and those who once served it. On one side stood Elac and the loyal Hunnic forces. On the other, a powerful coalition led by Ardaric, king of the Gepids. Ardaric, once Attila's trusted general and loyal ally, now turned against his former overlords. He led a broad alliance of tribes who had grown weary of the endless tribute and bloodshed demanded by Hunnic dominance. The battle likely took place somewhere in the Carpathian Basin, perhaps near the river Nedao, the very heart of Attila's power. There, the empire he had built faced its final reckoning. Both sides assembled vast armies. The Huns still possessed their deadly cavalry and relied on tactics that had once crushed Roman legions, swift charges, mounted archery, and feigned retreats. But the rebels had learned from their former masters. They had fought beside the Huns for years and knew their every maneuver. Their infantry held the line with spears and shields, while their own cavalry counterattacked with precision. The clash was ferocious and chaotic, remembered in later accounts as one of the bloodiest in the age of migration. In the end, the Huns were overwhelmed. Elac fell in battle, his death both symbolic and fatal to the loyalist cause. The remnants of the Hunnic army scattered, their once mighty unity shattered. The empire, already cracking from within, finally collapsed. The Gepids under Ardaric rose as a new power in the Danube region, while the Ostrogoths embarked on their own migrations that would reshape the post-Roman West. Other tribes, the Rugians, the Heruli, and many more, seized lands of their own, asserting full independence. Attila's surviving sons struggled in vain to hold on to fragments of power. Dengizich, determined to revive his father's legacy, led a smaller Hunnic force eastward, raiding eastern Roman territories and attempting to negotiate from a position of weakness. But his campaigns achieved little. His troops were too few, his influence too diminished. Eventually, Dengizich was defeated and killed in battle with Roman forces. His severed head was sent to Constantinople, publicly displayed as a symbol of victory over a once feared empire. With his death, the last embers of Hunnic might were extinguished. Ernak, the youngest son, withdrew further east and ruled a small remnant of the Huns on the steppe. But even that fragmentary realm faded from history, as the Huns gradually merged with other nomadic peoples or disappeared entirely. The collapse of their empire had far-reaching consequences. It removed the greatest destabilizing force in Europe and allowed new powers to emerge. The Eastern Roman Empire regained a measure of stability, while the West, already crumbling, saw the rise of barbarian successor kingdoms. The fall of the Huns marked a turning point in Eurasian history. They had proven that a nomadic confederation under extraordinary leadership could challenge the might of Rome and alter the balance of continents. Yet they also revealed how fragile such power was when built solely on military dominance and personal charisma, without lasting institutions or written traditions. Their disappearance left a haunting silence. Unlike other conquerors, the Huns left behind no cities, no monuments, no written chronicles, only fear, legend, and fragments of memory. Their sudden rise and fall became a mystery that echoed through centuries. Some remnants drifted east, settling near the lower Danube, or retreating into the Pontic-Caspian steppe. There, they mingled with Sarmatians, Alans, and later Turkic-speaking tribes, their identity dissolving into new confederations. The Avars, who appeared in Europe a century later, were sometimes called Huns by Byzantine chroniclers, perhaps out of confusion, or perhaps as a deliberate invocation of an old terror. Though their bloodlines vanished into the vastness of the steppe, their legacy endured. Every great horse-borne empire that followed, the Avars, the Magyars, the Mongols, would carry echoes of Attila's storm. In barely 2 generations, the Huns rose from obscurity to dominate the Roman world, then vanished without a trace. Their empire dissolved, their name became legend, and their story remains one of history's most astonishing, vanishing acts. The emphasis on mobility, mounted archery, tribal leadership, and flexible political alliances remained central features of steppe empires long after the Huns vanished from the Roman world. In this way, the cultural imprint of the Huns endured, not as a distinct civilization, but as a persistent influence within the evolving dynamics of the steppe. Another avenue through which the Huns left their mark was legend and oral tradition. Although they disappeared as a political force, their impact lived on in the stories of those they had ruled, fought, or terrified. Among the Germanic peoples, the Huns entered heroic literature. In the Nibelungenlied, a foundational epic of medieval Germanic tradition, the character of Etzel is widely believed to reflect Attila. Though the poem transforms historical events into myth, it captures the enduring memory of Hunnic power and its lasting impression on Central European consciousness. In the Roman world, Attila remained a symbol of apocalyptic dread. Christian chroniclers of the 6th and 7th centuries continued to depict him as a divine scourge, a punishment sent by God for the sins of the empire. His memory became entwined with theological interpretations of decline and judgment. Yet, even as he was demonized, Attila commanded a measure of respect. He had been the only man in living memory to compel emperors to pay tribute and to reach the gates of both Constantinople and Rome. Archaeologically, the Huns left little trace. Their nomadic way of life meant they built few permanent structures and no cities. Graves scattered across Eastern Europe yielded weapons, horse gear, and ornaments, but rarely inscriptions. Scholars rely on these scarce findings alongside often hostile Roman accounts to reconstruct their society. Even in absence, their presence is palpable. The lack of monumental legacy underscores the radically different nature of Hunnic power, one rooted not in buildings or bureaucracy, but in speed, intimidation, and personal command. Some Hunnic families likely persisted under other names, absorbed into local communities. In regions like Pannonia and Dacia, where the Huns had settled in numbers, aspects of their culture may have been transmitted across generations. Linguistic traces are minimal, but certain names and traditions hint at lingering Hunnic influence, especially where intermarriage with Gothic or Roman provincial elites occurred. Meanwhile, the empire they had terrorized underwent its own transformations. The Western Roman Empire collapsed within decades of Attila's death. Though the Huns had not directly caused the final fall, their campaigns had accelerated its decline. The Eastern Roman Empire, by contrast, endured and adapted, learning lessons from the Hunnic invasions that shaped Byzantine military and diplomatic strategies for centuries. The dispersal of the Huns exemplifies a common pattern in nomadic imperial history. Steppe empires often rose swiftly and fell just as quickly. Without stable institutions or central administration, cohesion depended entirely on a singular, charismatic leader. When that leader died, as with Attila, the empire unraveled, and its components were reabsorbed into the landscape from which they had emerged. Yet their legacy should not be underestimated. The Huns had redrawn the map of Europe, upended the balance of power, triggered mass migrations, and forced Rome into concessions previously unimaginable. They demonstrated the vulnerability of even the greatest empires to highly mobile external threats. Their disappearance left enduring questions about identity, resilience, and the fragile line between terror and authority. With the Huns gone, Europe entered a phase of fragmentation and transformation. While the immediate menace had vanished, the vacuum they left brought both relief and instability. Freed from steppe conquest, the Roman world, particularly the West, faced new challenges. This was not a restoration of imperial strength, but a gradual unraveling, power struggles among emerging barbarian kingdoms, and a subtle yet irreversible shift in European civilization. In the years following Attila's death and the dissolution of his empire, the Western Roman Empire spiraled further into terminal decline. Though the immediate fear of another Hunnic invasion had passed, the damage of decades of warfare and tribute could not be undone. Northern Italian cities, still reeling from Attila's campaign, remained devastated. Agriculture faltered, trade networks collapsed, and infrastructure lay in ruins. Flavius Aetius, the Roman general who had been the last true defender of Western imperial interests, was assassinated shortly after the Huns disappeared. Emperor Valentinian III, wary of Aetius's growing power and swayed by court intrigue, killed him during a court audience. Yet Valentinian's triumph was short-lived. He himself was assassinated within a year, possibly by loyalists of Aetius or other factions enraged by the ongoing instability. This chain of killings triggered a spiral of disorder. The central government faltered, the military command broke down, and provincial leaders in Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa acted independently. Roman authority eroded swiftly. The Visigoths, formerly federates, asserted dominance in southwestern Gaul. The Burgundians expanded along the Rhone Valley. In North Africa, the Vandals under Gaiseric consolidated control over Carthage and the western Mediterranean. The absence of the Huns revealed an ironic truth. Their presence had indirectly maintained imperial cohesion. By serving as a common threat, they had compelled reluctant cooperation between Romans and their allies. Once that pressure vanished, old rivalries resurfaced. The remaining Western resources were spent on internal disputes rather than coordinated recovery. In the East, stability fared better. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, survived the Hunnic invasions through diplomacy, tribute, and strategic military action. Though it had endured the humiliation of paying Attila, it reasserted control over the Balkans and fortified its northern defenses. Its bureaucracy remained intact, and a reorganized army became the backbone of a resurgent Byzantine state. This divergence was no accident. The East had stronger economic foundations, more secure administration, and fewer internal divisions. The West, by contrast, suffered chronic civil wars, economic collapse, and central authority disintegration. When the Huns retreated, the East recovered, while the West continued to decay. The culmination came in the late 5th century. Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain and former Roman commander, deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in Ravenna. This symbolic act ended the Western imperial line. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring a single emperor in the East sufficient. Though nominally a vassal of the Eastern Empire, he ruled Italy independently. Rome itself had ceased to be the imperial capital. Its symbolic authority endured, but real power now lay in the hands of generals, warlords, and provincial rulers, carving out domains from the remnants of Roman administration. Yet the echoes of Hunnic influence persisted. The geopolitical map of Europe had been reshaped by their presence. Visigothic migrations into the West and Vandal conquests in North Africa were accelerated by Hunnic pressure decades earlier. Though the Huns did not govern these regions, their campaigns catalyzed military, demographic, and political transformations. The fall of the Hunnic Empire also allowed new powers to rise. The Ostrogoths, once under Hunnic domination, regained independence under Theodoric the Great, eventually migrating into Italy and establishing Gothic rule that briefly revived the Roman heartlands. The Eastern Roman Empire also internalized key lessons, refining diplomacy, fortifying frontiers, and developing strategies for managing nomadic threats, knowledge that would prove vital against Slavs, Avars, Bulgars, and early Turkic groups in later centuries. Experiences with Attila shaped Byzantine military and diplomatic thought for generations. In cultural memory, Rome's encounter with the Huns became a touchstone for imperial vulnerability and divine judgment. Christian writers interpreted their invasions as punishment for Rome's sins, moral decay, and spiritual failures. The destruction of cities, desecration of churches, and countless deaths were framed as divine retribution, casting the Huns as instruments of judgment rather than mere raiders. Despite the trauma, Roman influence persisted. Latin remained dominant. In the West, Roman law survived in adapted forms, and municipal traditions continued within the new barbarian kingdoms. Yet the Roman world had transformed. It was no longer a centralized empire, but a fragmented mosaic, partly shaped by its struggle with the Huns. The disappearance of the Huns did not bring peace. It marked the beginning of a new era of regional conflict, realignment, and cultural transformation. The Huns had been both symptom and catalyst of a larger process, the collapse of a centuries-old world order. Their rise exposed imperial weaknesses. Their fall demonstrated that the past could not be restored, though the Hunnic Empire vanished. From Europe's political map, the memory of the Huns, especially Attila, endured far longer. In many ways, they disappeared faster than the fear and fascination they inspired. Generations after their retreat, they lived on in legend, chronicled by Roman writers, remembered in Germanic songs, and woven into medieval myths that transformed historical deeds into symbols of terror and admiration. To understand how the Huns were remembered, one must examine contemporary Roman and Byzantine sources. Most writers had never encountered the Huns directly, but had lived under the shadow of their raids and campaigns. They described the Huns as almost supernatural, nomadic, alien, cruel, and unstoppable. Ammianus Marcellinus, one of the earliest Roman authors to depict them, emphasized their strangeness, portraying them as subhuman, living without cooked food, permanent dwellings, or recognizable language, and barely civilized. These depictions reflected Roman ethnocentrism. The Huns' nomadic lifestyle, lack of architecture, and foreign customs were interpreted not merely as different, but as inferior. Roman writers also used such portrayals for political purposes. It amplified the threat of the Huns, reinforcing Roman fear and justifying failures. When emperors paid tribute or fled before an invasion, the narrative of barbarian otherness helped explain and rationalize such actions. Yet even within these hostile portrayals, a peculiar respect for Attila emerged. Priscus, a Roman diplomat who visited Attila's court, offered a more nuanced, first-hand account. He described Attila as stern, disciplined, and remarkably restrained in his personal habits. Unlike his warriors, who adorned themselves in lavish clothing and indulged in feasts, Attila dressed simply, drank sparingly, and conducted himself with quiet authority. Priscus's observations, though filtered through a Roman lens, captured Attila as a real and complex leader, not merely a figure of fear, but a ruler with charisma, control, and presence. Over time,
as the memory of actual events faded, the image of the Huns transformed in cultural imagination.
in the Germanic world, they became characters in heroic sagas. Attila, referred to as Etzel in the Nibelungenlied, a medieval German epic composed centuries after his death, is portrayed not merely as a destroyer, but as a mighty king, noble in some respects, enmeshed in the tragic destinies of Germanic heroes. The historical Attila's fearsome traits were softened and romanticized. His court became a stage for honor, vengeance, and sorrow. This transformation reveals how societies reshaped the Huns to fit their own narratives. For Germanic peoples who had once feared and fought under Attila, he became part of their origin myths, a powerful outsider whose legacy merged into their cultural DNA. His depiction, while not strictly historical, illustrates the psychological imprint the Huns left on the populations they confronted. In Norse tradition, too, Attila's memory persisted. The Volsunga saga and other Old Norse texts include characters and episodes echoing Hunnic dominance and interactions with Germanic tribes. Though fictionalized, these narratives reflect a pattern, the integration of Attila and the Huns into the mythic framework of early medieval Northern Europe. Meanwhile, in Christian tradition, Attila's legacy assumed another form. He was widely referred to as the Scourge of God, a term appearing in both Eastern and Western ecclesiastical writings. This label did more than condemn him as a villain. It framed his invasions as divine punishment, a chastisement from God for a sinful, declining Roman world. Such interpretations served theological and political purposes, explaining Rome's suffering not as failure or decay, but as a test of faith and morality. Church historians used Attila's story to preach repentance. His power to humble emperors and destroy cities was cited as a warning against pride and excess. Some even claimed that prayers and fasting had saved Rome from complete destruction, elevating religious figures like Pope Leo I to near miraculous status. These narratives enhanced the Church's authority, portraying spiritual power as superior to military might. In the centuries that followed, the memory of the Huns evolved further. During the Middle Ages, European chroniclers sometimes used Hun as a general label for any savage or foreign invader, blurring distinctions between steppe peoples. When the Avars appeared in the 6th century, Byzantine sources occasionally called them Huns. Later, in the 9th century, when the Magyars arrived in the Carpathian Basin, some medieval writers claimed they were descendants of Attila's warriors returning to reclaim their homeland. This idea, based not on linguistic or archaeological evidence but on inherited fear, illustrates how Attila became archetypal. He represented not a single man or people, but a recurring threat from the east, a symbol of invasion, fire, and the collapse of order. This archetype persisted in European consciousness long after the last Hunnic horse had crossed the Danube. In modern times, the term Hun gained new political meanings. During World War I, British propaganda referred to German soldiers as Huns, invoking images of barbarism and brutality. Though far from historical reality, this usage shows how deeply the idea of the Huns had embedded itself in European cultural language. A people long vanished could still symbolize destruction and the collapse of civilization. Yet for all these layers of myth and fear, historians today strive to understand the Huns as real people, shaped by environment, needs, and strategy. The old view of Huns as mindless destroyers has given way to nuance. Scholars now recognize their societal complexity, skilled horse archery, flexible military tactics, pragmatic diplomacy, and the ability to unify diverse groups under a powerful leadership model. Archaeological discoveries across the Carpathian Basin, Pontic steppe, and Danube frontier reveal more about Hunnic burial practices, trade, and material culture. These findings portray a people who were not merely warriors, but participants in the broader economic and cultural networks of late antiquity. The challenge of reconstructing Hunnic history lies in the absence of their own written records. Everything we know comes from outsiders, often enemies. This makes reconstruction difficult but not impossible. Through cross-examination of texts, archaeology, and comparative studies with other nomadic cultures, historians continue to bring the Huns from the shadow of legend into the light of critical understanding. The story of the Huns is not simply that of a vanished empire. It is part of a recurring pattern, the dynamic between steppe and sedentary civilizations that shaped human history for centuries. From their obscure origins on Central Asian grasslands to their sudden impact on the edges of the Roman world, The Huns exemplified the potential of nomadic societies to transform established political orders. The rise of the Huns disrupted late antiquity. Their mobility, adaptability, and capacity for war and diplomacy placed them in a category unlike anything Rome had faced before. They did not seek to build cities or emulate imperial institutions. Instead, they mastered extraction, demanded tribute, commanded fear, and shaped geopolitics through speed and strategic violence. Yet their strength was also a vulnerability. Their decentralization granted flexibility but left them prone to fragmentation. Their empire lasted not through institutions, but through the authority of one man. When Attila died, that authority vanished. Without a central hand, their cohesion dissolved. What followed was not silence, but absorption. The peoples they had ruled, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Alans, and others, reasserted themselves. Some moved into vacated Roman spaces.
Others fought each other.
Some even adopted elements of Hunnic military practice, itself drawn from earlier steppe nomads. In this way, the Huns left behind more than ruins, tactics, strategies, and models of rule influencing future empires. Indeed, the Huns were part of a broader continuum of nomadic power across Eurasia. Before them, the Xiongnu challenged China. After them, the Avars, Magyars, and later the Mongols followed similar paths, moving west, forming coalitions, threatening sedentary states, and eventually integrating into the political landscapes they once seemed poised to destroy. This continuity highlights a historical reality. The steppe was not a void beyond civilization, but a distinct geopolitical space. Nomadic societies like the Huns had their own leadership, legitimacy, and organization. They were not failed empires. They were empires of a different kind, so what changed? After the Huns, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. But this collapse was not solely the work of Attila and his horsemen. It was the culmination of centuries of internal decline, economic stress, and structural fragility. The Huns accelerated the process, exposing vulnerabilities already present, forcing Rome to confront military, financial, and ideological limits. In the East, however, the Roman world endured. The Byzantine Empire adapted, restructured, and survived. It learned to manage nomadic powers through diplomacy, intelligence, and pragmatic treaties, recognizing that not all threats could be met by force. This sophisticated approach to frontier management served the Byzantines for centuries. What resonates today is the nature of disruption. The Huns were above all a force of disruption. They did not overthrow Rome with a single battle or by capturing the capital. They reshaped the world through persistent pressure, strategic unpredictability, and the harnessing of mobility. Their legacy reminds us that power does not always derive from institutions or population size. Sometimes it comes from the ability to move, adapt, and strike where others cannot. Modern states no longer face steppe invasions, but the pattern endures. Disruptive forces, technological, economic, or political, continue to challenge complex systems. History teaches that stability is rarely permanent. It must be maintained through foresight, flexibility, and the capacity to respond to forces emerging beyond traditional centers of power. The Huns, in their brief ascendancy, showed what happens when a world assumes its order is secure, and it is not. Their story is not merely about the fall of cities or the death of an empire. It is about the sudden arrival of a new kind of power and how the world must respond. In the end, the Huns vanished, absorbed into the history they had violently altered. Yet their impact remained woven into Europe's evolution, remembered in legend, and echoed in the rise of later nomadic powers. They were for a time the storm on the steppe, the ones who came, who saw, and who forced a world to change. And though their names may fade, the questions they raised about power, resilience, and response remain as relevant today as they were on the day Attila crossed the Danube.